Let me introduce to you our interviewee from our advisory board, Golbin. So Alex is the Global Head of Assessment Services for IHS Markit KY3P. That's a mouthful. I don't know how you say that when you introduce yourself, but hopefully it's just IHS. This is the first centralized third-party risk management data hub. They are based in New York, and Alex leads the firm's risk assessment business, which helps banks improve their risk posture, meet their evolving regulatory requirements, and to reduce costs. With more than 20 years of expertise in IT transformation and financial services, Alex joins IHS Markit, originally from Bank of New York Mellon, where he recently served as the global head of technology for third-party governance. He was also then recruited by Bank of New York Mellon in 1988 to oversee a progressive array of responsibilities in IT management, including cost optimization, quality assurance, process improvement, and risk mitigation. And as a recognized expert in vendor engagement across financial services, Alex is a frequent speaker in industry conferences and regularly publishes through different types of leadership publications. He holds an MBA in finance from NYU Stern, my school, and a Bachelor of Computer Science from NYU Tandon School of Engineering. And he's also working as a certified project management professional. So please welcome Alex to the program. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're going to ask you as we go along through the interview process, make sure that you're muted. And if you have questions at the end, we will open it up for the last 15, 20 minutes or so to take questions from the audience. So please feel free to put those in your chat as we go along. And Alex, we'll kick off with talking about trends. What do you see as some of the emerging trends in vendor risk management?
Thanks, Ariel. Yeah, I think that the one that we're seeing the most is really understanding deeper the supply chain. So it's no longer sufficient just to do the traditional approach of classifying your vendors across the portfolio. It's really more becoming about the vendors of your vendors. And that's really very apparent what's happening in the news with various executive orders, with various political risks, really looking not just at the security posture, but also the corporate social responsibility restrictions. Nobody wants to do business with someone whose major supplier is violating corporate social responsibility guidelines and getting the news. So it's becoming really interesting. And I think the big gap, of course, there is not enough data available for any of this. So everyone knows what they need to do, but nobody can really do it well.
And not enough people to do it either, because
Right.
This is something that's an afterthought for most organizations and not something that they've prioritized or created a special position for, which is one of the reasons why we're working with the Committee on the Vendor Risk Management Program to provide this type of training to people. So supply chain risk, we've seen quite a bit of different data breaches that are associated with third-party suppliers, and 63% of reported breaches are attributed to them. In your opinion, which is the one that stands out the most as the greatest offender? Like, who's your poster child when you like to talk to customers about this?
Well, I think the Equifax, although it was a while ago, is a really good one just because it impacted so many people personally. So of course, many of us got our identity stolen. That one is also good because it really demonstrates the fact that it came through a vendor. It came through a very small, traditionally low-risk vendor. It was, I think, an air conditioning company somewhere in Pennsylvania. It demonstrated the fact that patch management was not applied appropriately. There was, that was a big gap. And it's interesting because as you look back and years gone by, I'm not convinced that a lot of financial services customers and other big companies really still patched all their vulnerabilities in the very same open source environment that caused the Equifax breach. So that one is really good.
Actually, one of the interesting points about that data breach is that TransUnion and Experian did patch that particular breach. So when the regulators went back to look at Equifax, one of the things that they said was there was willful neglect because people in the same industry, in the same exact business, knew about it and patched it, and they didn't. So this was something that I found very interesting as well about that. One of the other things that's interesting is Target, and the reason why we like to highlight Target, even though it was back in 2013, was this is when cyber became a boardroom issue, and that we saw that many companies, cybersecurity was simply an IT problem, and when the Target breach happened, 7 out of the 10 board members were ousted and the CEO was let go. So the impact that we saw was finally coming full circle in terms of understanding that vendors are, simply people that you are entrusting your data to and your processes, and that they need to be part of your cybersecurity program. So next question is, what are some of the key challenges that you understand in understanding risk across an extended enterprise?
So I think the biggest issue is, to do it right, you really need to look at all of your vendors. And if you're a big company, you would have thousands and tens of thousands and maybe even hundreds of thousands of vendors. And it's very difficult to understand what they are, who they are and what they do for you. And then what you really need to do is take all of your vendor services, classify them based on inherent risk, really understand what is the risk treatment strategy, and then you start executing due diligence activities. So once you get to the due diligence activities, it becomes very difficult. But even before you get there, the fact is it's very difficult for a large company to even take the entire portfolio and say, well, great, how do I even do this? Because they have to rely on people who are consuming those services, that software, that infrastructure. And a lot of times those people really don't know what they're doing. A lot of times, a lot of those vendors maybe have been procured years ago, and somebody is just paying maintenance licenses, and it kind of slips through every crack, and then it ends up being, well, it's a low risk vendor, I'm not going to do any due diligence in them. So I actually believe that the biggest risk to every company is not just the overall vendor portfolio, it's that long tail of what they call low risk vendors, because one of them will always blow up, and everyone always gets surprised when they find out, well, was that in scope of the program and how did we miss it? And it's just very easy to do that based on how the availability of the data is structured in that space.
Right. So I think of extended enterprise and I think about, okay, what are these vendors actually doing for us? Are they a cloud service provider? So we have a shared responsibility model with them. And what is that shared responsibility model? Or are they a technology vendor who's supposed to be providing us with patches? Or are they a service vendor like an accountant or an attorney or, McKinsey, Deloitte, managed consulting companies that are touching our digital assets and working with us? And how do we understand the level of exposures that we have with them so that we can prioritize and figure it out? And you mentioned another thing that I think is really critical is the whole idea of we have existing relationships that go back 10, 15, 20 years, right, with existing vendors. And I remember when I was CISO, we were doing a vendor risk program and we had only 400, so it wasn't that bad, that were IT related. And we had to go back and rediscuss the contracts with them. And, sometimes the business unit was not very happy about that in terms of the relationship that they've already established. So I think, new versus existing vendors in a vendor risk program have different kinds of things that we have to think about and to understand okay, well, how do we have conversations that are not going to be easy to have with the business first and then with the vendors later? So extended supply chain is very important for us. One of the things that came to mind also, and this I guess will lead into the next question, is when you're looking at fourth party risk, right? So we've got third parties who we have the direct relationships with, but now we have third parties who have third parties, and those are our fourth parties, right? So what are we seeing there in terms of stepping things up or not stepping things up in terms of the thinking and what's happening in the ecosystem?
So fourth parties are really interesting. And it's also interesting that OCC just in March published FAQs based on their 2013 bulletin in terms of third-party risk management. And they specifically clarify that you're really supposed to be doing risk assessments on all of your business relationships, whether you have a contract with them or not. You really need to understand if you have some sort of an engagement, if you have some sort of a relationship, if you have some sort of a dependency, you have to do a fit for purpose risk assessment. To your point, once it comes to fourth parties, fifth parties, well, I mean, now all bets are off. So the right way of doing it, of course, is to really have an inventory of your third parties, reach out part of the diligence process to the third parties and ask them, who are your critical suppliers? I want to know who they are, what they do for you. Are you appropriately managing them? And then show me the results of that risk assessment. The challenge is often third parties are not willing to share that type of detail, and it's really cost prohibitive to do at scale. So we do see creative ways of handling this. So actually, that's one of the things we are prioritizing among the banks that we are working with today at IHS Markit, looking at a variety of data from the outside in, just to at least give an initial indicator of what's going on. And there are ways some of the creative companies are picking up digital footprint and can automatically discover also some of the fourth parties. So that's not foolproof, but it's also a helpful input to kind of know for a given vendor, here are their third parties, so that can be taken into consideration. You can look up at various financial health scores. You can look at location risk indicators. You can look at some of the cybersecurity scores, but that's only to give you initial sense. You're really gonna have to go and really ask your third parties, hey, what's going on? Who are your fourth parties? And then also review your contracts, making sure that the contracts are clear, that if your critical third party outsources or changes something to a different third party, well, you kind of need to know about it. You need to have notification criteria and have ability to take action.
Right, exactly. So how do you see people playing a role in the cybersecurity postures of the vendors and companies? Do you see an increase in the amount of resources that are being spent here in terms of process and risk assessments, control assessments, and the ability to have an actual dedicated person in this area? Like when we first saw the CISO position come into fruition in the early part of the last decade, that was something that was, no one had ever anticipated that. Now we're seeing a need, I think, in this area for someone who has not only a vendor background that can look at contracts and can look at the relationships of the business and how the vendor is supposed to be working with the organization, but to look at it also from a cybersecurity perspective and to get clear on exactly what it is that you want to be doing with these vendors. And it goes into another question later on, but I'll save that for later. So what are you seeing with process people and the whole enchilada?
Yeah, and that's where I think the role of vendor risk management is really multidisciplined, and it's evolving. So to your point, Ariel, it's not about just a deep technical expertise in cybersecurity. It's not about just being able to manage stakeholders. It's not about just compliance. It's not about technology. It's all of that and more. And I think this is where there definitely is a need of that expertise. That expertise is difficult to just get naturally. You really have to invest in yourself and the training. And that's why I'm also excited to work with you and Pace University to try to establish this curriculum, because it's just so important, given the fact that more than half of the breaches are coming from vendors. There is tremendous amount of money that's being spent in every company's budget for vendors, and yet, right, we don't really have a formal kind of curriculum of thinking about it. So it's a great way for getting involved in a lot of different things. I think it's a great career track, and it's important to start shaping up what that actually looks like.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think the importance of educating in this area, we can't stress it more. We do an introduction to vendor risk management in the enterprise cybersecurity program that we're currently offering now. And it's just getting people to understand what the key issues are. But with this new program, we're actually going to be preparing people to actually be able to walk right into these positions. You can, tell them exactly how you would set up a vendor program and how you would work with existing vendors, how you would work with new vendors, how you're going to be looking at risk assessments and control assessments and the whole 9 yards. So this is going to be something very special, I think. So that kind of leads me into my other question. We've seen recently with the Department of Defense that they are putting more teeth into their relationships with vendors in a new program called CMMC, which is a cybersecurity maturity model capability. And what that is basically saying is that it is not enough just to trust a vendor. You have to trust and verify a vendor. So it goes back to the Reagan-Gorbachev kind of days of trust and verify. So what they're stipulating at this point is that there has to be a third-party assessment done, and then a ranking of 0 to 5. And then anyone who has a 3, 4, or 5 can bid on DoD contracts. And it's anyone who's handling sensitive, classified information. So what do you, I remember introducing this topic to my class a year and a half ago, and I had a couple vendors in the room and nobody was very happy about it. But what are you hearing and seeing around, the ability to really not just check a box, not just give a set of questionnaires and say, yes, we have access control, yes, we have encryption, but actually where you're having a need to come in and monitor and test that what they're saying is true?
So what Department of Defense is saying is definitely the right thing to do for the industry to drive transparency. And I think the similar transparency, there have been and continue to be multiple attempts in financial services to do the same thing and kind of say, well, we'll have utilities, we'll do this risk assessments, we'll promote transparency. I think the challenge will continue to be vendors continue to resist, right? Nobody loves the idea of having someone kind of forcing you to do this and then also to disclose your results. Because the fact is, if you look at the population of vendors and you look at the risk assessments that are conducted on them by their various customers, you do have findings, you often have findings, and vendors are not going to love the idea of just showcasing that and then have all of their customers gang up on them and say, well, no, you have to fix it because it's transparent. But I am really glad, though, that Department of Defense is taking this position, because that's going to give a nice push. And we've seen that also with some of the cloud providers when we established, not we, the government established FedRAMP and those types of certifications. And then by getting those certifications and independent control attestations, they really were forced to provide more transparency overall across the entire environment. And that also allowed them to lead by examples. And more of other mega vendors are now showcasing, here are my certifications, here's my compliance page. And I think that's great. So I'm personally committed to a mission of driving transparency across industries when it comes to vendor risk. I think the DoD proposition is going to be very challenging, but it's definitely going to help that cause. So I'm all in. I think that's the right direction.
Right. I see them treating this also sort of as a prioritization exercise in terms of, okay, these are our vendors that deal with our crown jewel assets and have the highest amount of exposures and risk. Okay, let's go with them first, and then so on and so forth. It's going to be interesting to see the conversations that happen when industry does start to adopt this. And I think there is a couple people that are talking about it now, but I don't have any details to share on that yet. So I'll wait till I do. Thank you for that. So have you ever seen cases where cybersecurity in the risk management perspective has strong impact to revenue versus the expense-driven activities? Because unfortunately, and one of the issues I think that we're having in cybersecurity, and why we don't have enough budget, and why we don't have enough people, process, and tools, is because we're treated as a cost center, and our budgeting comes out of the IT department's percentage of their spend, right? Which to me is not a effective model. So in terms of that type of revenue versus expense-driven activities, what are you seeing with the programs that are out there now?
So that's a great question. And you're right. People typically look at cybersecurity as just an additional budget item they need to grow. And it a little bit is like fear mongering, right? Like, oh my God, if you don't give me this budget, you're going to get hacked. You want to be responsible. Like, no, please take the money. But the fact is, there is a very different perspective. So a few things. And even with Department of Defense, I think, so if I'm a contractor to Department of Defense and I have to now select my suppliers, I need to pay for getting them risk assessed. So I need to know that their risk posture looks good enough so I can actually select them. And it's the same thing for the procurement process. I'm doing an RFP. I selected 5 suppliers. I really don't have time to do a full risk assessment on them. I would love to get some level of intelligence. Hey, what's going on? Which one is most likely to pass through the risk assessment? So I'm not going to get bid up later by my vendor risk management team. So what people maybe don't realize fully is that there is now an emerging trend of a lot of outside-in data being available. And financial health scores, cybersecurity rating providers are popping up every day. And not everyone believes in those ratings and those numbers. And I wouldn't necessarily use them to prioritize your own work. But the fact is there are hundreds of millions of dollars of private equity raised to fund all of that. And there's enough marketing out there. So people do look at that. So, and you are not in a room when somebody pulls up your company and pulls up one of the cybersecurity ratings, financial health ratings, and says, you know what? Yeah, I ran a report. Here are the 5 I'm considering. This one, I don't know. It just seems the score is very low. And then, you know what? Let's not select them for this bid. And that has a direct impact on revenue. So I think that that's really one thing, is that from the threat intelligence perspective, it's important to understand what are the actual threats, but also what are those outside factors that people may be pulling in, and there are new ones every day, and really get in front of that. So that's interesting, and I didn't personally realize that until I joined IHS Markit, and we're a major vendor to the industry. So not only I'm kind of running this assessment utility, but also seeing it from the other way. The other big thing is just the fact that there is tremendous amount of money being spent on third parties from any company. So like when I was at Bank of New York Mellon, I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars a year that we were overseeing just from third parties. And prioritizing that investment and balancing those decisions from the risk management perspective and actual cost optimization is a huge opportunity. And it really can play an enormous impact to the bottom line. So, I mean, I've done it firsthand. I know how much money can be saved by looking at it from those 2 lenses collectively. And that can pay for a lot of things. So I strongly encourage anyone who is running any type of vendor management program, don't make it only about vendor risk management, make it more about third-party management and look at it collectively so you can actually optimize that spend as well.
Great. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So when a lot of companies start a due diligence process with the vendor, they'll give them 200 to 300 different questions. And a lot of them don't have the proper context. So if I'm a cloud service provider, I'm doing something very different than if I am an accountant or a lawyer or someone else. And so in this due diligence process with questionnaires, what are some of your thoughts around ways to optimize this? How can this be done better? Usually they start off and it's like the overview section and then it's the financial section, but then they get into your cyber section, and your cyber section is the majority of the questionnaires. And it's everything from, your access controls down to, the most sophisticated levels of your disaster recovery and your redundancy and everything. So what are you seeing in terms of making that better, or is it not getting better, or what do you think?
Yeah, so that's one area where I feel passionate about, and in the work that I'm doing, I was able to make a lot of progress, starting to change that. So I don't believe in effectiveness of that checklist with just adding more and more questions. I really believe in thinking about it from risk management and not a checkbox exercise. And you want to think about it in terms of control objectives, because there is a big difference from you doing assessment of your own internal team where you have access to everything within your own company and you're really doing an audit. That's different. This is not an audit. This risk assessments are arm length. You don't have the resources, you don't have the money to spend months and months and years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to do equivalent work of getting like a SAT2 report. You're talking about, hey, can we spend a week? Can we spend a few days? Can we spend maybe a few $1,000s and really get comfortable? And by the way, it's a contractual relationship, so I can get that level of transparency anyway. So if you send more questions to your vendor, I mean, great. There is probably some account manager sitting there and trying to make things up for you. And if that makes you feel better, great. Or if there is a team of junior clerks offshore somewhere and sitting there making up answers, great. And it's not a great situation for the vendor, right? So a lot of vendors know they're exposed because this whole questionnaire business is just exploding. People who are answering it are not qualified. But the good news is nobody's reading it on the other side, so it doesn't matter. So this is not. This is, but this is what's going to be happening, right? I mean, it's like there is no bandwidth to really understand the risk, and there's no bandwidth to really answer those questions. So, I mean, in many cases, it's just like, hey, part of my process, I have to send this, and you got to answer something, and then I'm going to file it somewhere and hope everything is good. So if you look at it from a different perspective, so what we've been encouraging to do is to look at it from control objectives that map to leading industry frameworks and regulations. And then you look at that control objective holistically, and you get that information, you get that evidence, and you write your observations just at the control objective level. That actually allows you to have a more meaningful conversation, and it also allows you to get actual verification of evidence. And at the end of the day, the final product is a report. So what a lot of vendor risk management teams do, they think that, well, I'm going to produce this report. I have this 300 questions, and here are the ones that were not answered appropriately. But the problem is, like, nobody can read it. So now you take that report back, you give it to a senior business executive or somebody in procurement. They have no idea what to even do with it. They just want to know, so am I okay to sign this contract? I mean, it just does not become a meaningful conversation.
That is a problem. That really is a problem. This is the exact same problem that we've had for the past 2 decades with data from cybersecurity tools. When the CISO walks into the boardroom and hands the board a list of 300 vulnerabilities, and they're mystified and they're like, what's a man-in-the-middle attack? What's denial of service? They have no idea. But what they want to know is the same thing that you're talking about. They want to know, okay, this particular issue is connected to a crown jewel asset that has X amount of exposure. And if this asset is compromised, this is what it means, right? And it's the same thing you're talking about. It's exactly the same thing. It's like, okay, what are these vendors doing for you? And if this vendor has a problem, what does that mean for the business? And like, where do they, how do they compare to each other, right? And going back to what is the objectives? The objective is to provide meaningful data so that someone can make a business decision about if it's too much risk or it's not. And we can't do that unless we have metrics that people can trust, that are objective, that give us a really good handle on what risk actually is in relationship to the business objectives. I think you're onto something there for sure. That's good. Couple more questions, then we'll open it up in about 10 minutes or so. This one's interesting. So companies engage with other companies and they walk in and they're going through the procurement process. And how do you see the linkage between procurement and risk management, if there is one? And sort of in relationship to that question, the ask for the vendor to have a certain level of cyber insurance. And the reason why I bring that up is because we went into an organization and they said, well, you need $10 million of cyber insurance. And we're like, we're not inside your firewall. Number one. Number two, we're not dealing with any of your crown jewel assets, right? We're doing something very different. So we were able to negotiate that down to $1 million, which most people would just say, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to go spend $40,000 on cyber insurance, which is, a lot of money. So how do you see that procurement, risk management conversation happening or not happening today?
Yeah, so I think, so this was a two-part question. One was about procurement risk management, the other one, the extension of that to the cyber insurance conversation. So for procurement risk management, I think that it's very interesting. So I've seen in a lot of places where those two things are either combined, or if they're at least strongly aligned, you have just better controls. Because I mean, the fact that procurement is a machine that buys stuff, and they have a process, they normally have a platform in place, and they know you got to follow this process. Third-party risk management by itself sometimes is just isolated, and they miss things. Like they're like, well, you should be doing this. You shouldn't be buying from this vendor. But the fact that they have no teeth because they missed it because they're not plugged into the procurement process. And it's like, oh, okay. Well, I wish you would have told me yesterday. I just signed $100 million with this vendor. So I do think it's really important to tie the two together. I've seen it work well where they're physically together in one organization, or it could be separate but like strongly aligned. At the same time, I think it's also very clear that procurement skill set is so different from third-party risk management skill set, and the two are really polarized. And I actually believe that it would be great if there is some level of training for procurement professionals, for sourcing professionals, so they understand at some level third-party risk, because that will allow them to also negotiate the right terms when they negotiate these contracts. It's not all about just financial savings. So that is definitely a gap, I think, in the industry of kind of procurement folks are being looked at as like this hardcore negotiators, and they're just like buying like IBM mainframe licenses and signing this big, massive deals where, the industry is changing, and it's a lot, it's now morphed a lot more between risk and sourcing. So definitely opportunity to look at it that way. At the same time, I think that third-party risk management professionals, what I've seen, they grew up from maybe audit, or maybe just aligned to risk function. They have no idea that there's a commercial value at the table. That the fact is, I'm using these vendors not because I want to, it's because it runs my business. I'm spending hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think having commercial acumen and understanding some level of sourcing for third-party risk management professionals would probably also be somewhat helpful. So I do think it needs to start morphing more and more over time. It will always be different. Those folks who negotiate deals and contracts, I mean, it's a special skill. Some people love it, some people hate it. And you have to be comfortable with it. So you don't need to become a professional sourcing negotiator to do third-party risk. But just being aware of it is definitely going to make you work better with your procurement colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question. Industries vary by maturity in cybersecurity, financial services being the more mature, education being the least mature, and then everyone in between, right? From a financial services perspective, what are some of the things that you see that are happening in terms of assessing the third-party risk that you see maybe the less immature ones adopting sooner than later?
So I think that within financial services, the level of maturity goes by, well, here are large banks that are heavily regulated, to investment management firms that are not, and they're trying to do it because they feel it's a good thing to do, but they're a lot more flexible how they do it. But I think between data privacy laws, between just cybersecurity threats and regulations, the entire financial services industry is kind of rising up in terms of what they need to do assessing risk of their vendors. We see trends of also people realizing it's prohibitively expensive to do it bilaterally, because like hiring your own team of people who will just be chasing vendors, understanding this multiple dimensions, it's very difficult. So a lot of bets are being placed on these utilities that risk assess vendors and then give you results. So I run one of those utilities for IHS Markit. There are some others as well. It's not at a point across the industry where utilities reach the tipping scale yet, where it becomes a thing to do. But I think that that's really coming very close. And the thinking is that really, as you invest in even yourself from your career perspective, really transition from being that person who does the checklist exercise, but understanding how to manage risk and work with such utilities or other places where you can get this information, and then really look at it and assess the risk versus chase the vendor, send those emails, follow up, fill out something on your Archer system. Right. Two very different skill sets. So that's how I see it kind of evolve.
Yeah, this is such an important topic because we see so much more regulation that is being spun up just in the last 2 years with New York State Department of Financial Services, CCPA, GDPR, a lot of privacy regs, as well as at the state level now in the United States, a lot of discussion around privacy regulation. And one of the key elements in all of those that I just mentioned are to have a vendor risk management program, and they all define them so differently. And they don't have, some of them are, you know, somewhat prescriptive. And of course, HIPAA's had this in place with business associates for the last several years. But we're seeing more and more of a push towards making sure that it is in the scope of the compliance frameworks, as well as within the risk management and the procurement framework. So we're gonna open it up for some questions for Alex. So if you have a question, please type it in your chat so that we can see it. And we can then take a look at it. Okay, from Joe Vigorito. Thank you, Joe. Alex, can you comment on vendor risk in M&A due diligence, potentially inheriting the third and the fourth party risks assumed by the acquiring company? Excellent question. Thank you, Joe.
Oh, it's a great question. Thanks, Joe. So so I think an important point about M&A due diligence, in some cases you want to do due diligence where you really have opportunity to talk to the vendor and really kind of go and have the conversations. But in some cases, you really don't. I mean, some of the things that we get questions on, can you do due diligence in this vendor, but you cannot talk to this vendor? What can you tell me, at least initially? So this is where I think some of this outside in information and the multiple dimensions of risk come into play, where there is more and more of a digital footprint available on any given company. And there are new creative ways that it emerges where you really can start getting a sense of the risk posture from any company without ever talking to them. So for example, you can get a sense of their financial health by looking at multiple financial health scores. You can look at their cybersecurity kind of sort of footprint by looking at some of the cybersecurity ratings. Although again, this is, very much indirect. Then also there is a question of, well, what locations do they operate in, and taking a look at the location risk, taking a look at some of the interesting metrics. Like for example, I'm working with one of the startups in Silicon Valley right now, finalizing a partnership where they're able to use regression analysis with a statistical model to look at the history of data breaches and some of the people composition in a very unique, creative way to also evaluate probability of a data breach. So all of that is without even having any type of conversation. So that is an emerging an emerging method of using it for the M&A, but I wouldn't suggest just relying on that. I think if you are doing an M&A transaction at the minimum, if you have an opportunity, I would try to do a full kind of like on-site type of risk assessment if there is ever an opportunity.
Yeah, and one of the things that people need to keep in mind in M&A is that you're not going to migrate all of the systems over. You may take most of the data. So you're going to have to look at the technology risk versus the system risk and understand what those actually mean and what kind of exposures that you have, which is really key. Thank you, Joe, for that question. Okay, we have another question from Vlad. Do you believe that more thorough vendor risk and third-party management put smaller players in a big disadvantage due to a lack of skills, access to the same tools as the bigger players?
I think in some ways, yes. But also remember, if you're a smaller player, it's much easier for you in different ways because at least you know who your vendors are. Remember, the large banks, they have no idea who the vendors are. They just know, like, here is the vendors that they're paying, and they have to go through this massive effort to even classify and understand it. If you're a small player and you have maybe a 20 or 50 person company, it's going to be easy enough for you to make that list and classify it versus a large bank with like 50,000 people, 100,000 people. But yes, you will need to get some tools. You will need to get some expertise. So you may need to kind of hire more like third parties who have that expertise and supplement it versus hiring yourself. So in some ways, yes, it does put you a little bit in a disadvantage because there's some minimum amount of investment you have to make to do this, and that's going to take a bigger part of your overall revenue than potentially, a large bank.
Makes sense. Thanks for that, Vlad. From Fernando, what do you think about combining traditional TMRP risk activities, meaning risk profiling, assessments, et cetera, with monitoring of the vendor's digital footprint from the deep and the dark web signals?
Yeah, I like that. So I believe in saying that, well, identify your critical vendors using your risk ranking methodology. You cannot really take a shortcut and rely just on continuous monitoring from the dark web. You have to still do it the right way. but I do really like the idea of also using some of those financial health and cybersecurity rating providers to baseline and then put continuous monitoring in place. Because as I was saying earlier, even if you don't care about it and you don't believe that that it adds any value, the fact that they're telling you about this dark web stuff and open ports and the botnets, remember, others can see it too. So you don't want to be disadvantaged by getting excluded from an RFP and impacting your revenue. So baseline, clean it up, and just have a continuous monitoring in place.
Yeah. Thanks, Fernando, for that question. From Jason, excuse me. Can you talk more about how you're approaching environments where the third-party risk is known, prevalent in the industry, but is mostly ignored at the industry level, and the organization has little power individually to change it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is definitely an emerging trend that's saying ESG is really important in vendor risk management. And we see it now. Some of our larger banking customers are asking and demanding it. So luckily, you don't have to rely just going to every vendor and asking them corporate social responsibility ESG questions. That's one way of doing it. There's a lot of there are a lot of data providers now that are either established or emerging that they can give you those ratings, and you can start pulling that in. So we're trying to work with some of them now to pull that in and make it an integral part of the risk assessment process, because it's really important. And actually, there was something in the news this week, right, that some of the major Chinese suppliers kind of got their hands slapped for doing some violations, and they're major suppliers to the big American companies. So I don't think those companies can do business with them anymore, and everyone who's using those major suppliers will have to think about doing something different.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that, Jason. From Anjay, some insurance claim processes with insurance panel law firms possess a risk not representing the victim, rather representing the insurance claim cost protection. Can you please comment on this issue? We see now more companies hiring their cyber counsel because of this friction, and moving to insurance firms that do not enforce panel vendors, specifically at the law firm level. That's an interesting question.
That's an interesting one. And this is where I think that I have to be honest, I'm not intimately familiar with this particular one. I can tell you though that I see that there is, and I think Ariel brought it up earlier, there is definitely a connection between cyber insurance and vendor risk management. And even for cases where vendors are being asked to kind of sign up for this, like tens of millions of cyber insurance to kind of protect their customer, they really should try to push back and try to kind of negotiate something more reasonable. But in many cases, those kind of cyber insurance policies, getting one and saying you have it versus, to your point, then going through the claim process, it's kind of two different things, and it would vary in quality.
Yeah, true. I think it's a really great question. I don't have an opinion on it personally, but you know, there can be friction here. There can be bias that needs to be pulled out of this equation. So it's a good question, Anjay. Thank you. AJ asks, is the focus of vendor risk management mostly on prevention, or is it moving towards some kind of collaboration in terms of incident response?
Yeah, it's both. I think it's definitely prevention. That's a big part of the risk assessment process, and a lot of the controls have to do specifically with how do you make sure that you avoid all these bad things that can happen. But then there is also a very large set of control objectives that you need to check against for if there is an incident. Do you have an incident management process? How do you recover from it? How do you notify your customers? You know, this is where also the cyber insurance conversation comes in. If there is an incident and now there are damages, do you have cyber insurance? All of that is equally important. So I think it's both.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that question, AJ.
Ariel,
Okay, we've
it's
got,
Urs.
hey, Urs.
Hi, can I just
Hi.
add to what Alex said? A very good conversation, Alex. Thank you. I'm enjoying it. It's that last question. I think it's also about determining liability. Who's on point to pay the breach? So it's also about who owns, who needs to satisfy that breach at the end of the day. Is it the third party or is it the core company? And that's a big part of it. That's a big part of it, but so it's kind of gets lost in the work around vendor risk management, but it is about determining liability.
Hi, Urs. Thank you for that, and good to see you. You're exactly right, and I think a lot of that becomes a negotiation up front in the contract between the vendor and the customer, and there's a lot of back and forth to determine that. But also this is what you were saying is very important. It highlights the importance of having the right expertise to negotiate those terms and embed it directly into your contracts with your vendors, so then you can be better protected once an incident actually happens.
Exactly. And Janelle, who is on the insurance side of things, is saying organizations are looking to have success regarding influencing indemnity and hold harmless language in their vendor contracts, which I think would be a tough sell if you were trying to, get someone to actually sign the contract like that. But has anyone out there heard anything in reference to that as well? If you could, put it in the chat, that would be interesting. See if that's a direction things are going in. And thank you, Urs.
Yeah, and I can tell you that I see that every day. I see as we work with a lot of different vendors, because we also have a platform we're trying to get them to use. We're always being asked by some of them about indemnification, limits, who's responsible in what case. So that is definitely a conversation for many of the players in the industry to kind of consider that as part of their vendor risk management process, and before they put their data into any type of third-party platform, to ask the question, well, who's responsible in case if there is a data breach, and how am I protected, and who is indemnifying whom?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's great. I have a few more minutes left. Last minute question. Okay, well, we'll give everybody back their 3.5 minutes. Oh, it helps. Coffee. Alex, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure having you on the program today. And everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this. And remember, it will be available online to share with your colleagues, your peers, friends, frenemies, whoever you got out there. So thank you, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, you're welcome. Bye, everybody.